session 6. Biblical sexuality and the family. These are somewhat related to one another. My goal here this is session 6, my goal here in this session is to consider biblical sexuality and its God-ordained culmination in the family. So, going back to Genesis 1:26 through 31, you see that one of the admonitions that's given after male and female are made in God's image, they're said to be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. This is to bear children. And then later on in Ephesians 6:1 through 4, Paul follows his instruction and his admonitions regarding marriage with a discussion of what? Anybody? Children. Ephesians 6:1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. This is a restatement of the 5th commandment. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. And then it has an exhortation to fathers. Do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Not only has God ordered our bodies in sexuality to be joined together in the context of marriage with a spouse, his orderedness of that is for the procreation of a family of children. Some of the things that means is that it's implicit that children should be raised in a family. It's interesting that that's where that instruction falls. In fact, Ephesians 6:2 assumes what? There's a father and a mother. Honor your father and mother. And I think it's important, and again, I need to figure out a way to state this to make sure that it's understood. We are looking at an ideal. And what I mean the ideal is not that you're less of a person if you don't have this, but rather that this is how God has structured the world to work in principle. Okay? Some situations prevent kids from having father and mother. What we're saying is, though, that's the ideal. You go find me one sociological study that says that it's a good thing for a child to be raised without a father. Yeah. If you find that, I can tell you who's funding it. Because that is devastating to a child. Why? Because God intended children to be raised in a family. Now, what does that mean? As he intends children to be raised in the family, what's the ideal situation for a child to be raised in? Where there's a committed father and mother. Where does their commitment stem from? Their understanding of their union before God and man in what? Marriage. Yet one of the things that our current culture has allowed us to do, or has encouraged us to do, is we have been able, through technology, you call it that, medical advance, if you want to call it that, to separate or remove the potentiality of life in the context of marriage in such a way that now sexuality and expression of that sexuality in the context of marriage is about pleasure and not procreation. You're going, wow, where are we going with that? Am I suggesting that there are never times or places for some sort of contraceptive, whether it is barrier or natural planting, things like that? I'm not suggesting that, okay? And we can get into the nitty-gritty details of those types of things, okay? But here's an example of what I'm saying. I'm saying that the sexual revolution that began in the 60s was perpetuated on this idea, in many ways, of sexual pleasure without the potential of accountability, free love, and what facilitated that? What facilitated the instability of the family? One of the things that did that was contraceptive methods like the pill. There was no need to commit to anybody because I was not going to be responsible for that kid because that kid wasn't going to come into this world. No problem, right? And then if that didn't work, just kill it. Is the family unit better today now that we have been progressive regarding our views of sexuality? It's fallen apart. Might that be because we removed God's gift of sex from the context of marriage with the aim toward building family, and what we have said is that I want to live how I want to live. I want to use your gift, but I want to use it in the way that I deem most acceptable. Now, here's what's interesting. And again, if I haven't encouraged you enough to be back next week, because here's what's interesting, is now we're finding studies. It has never been easier in this world to be promiscuous. And what I mean by that is there are apps available. And I'm not telling this to trigger any of you. There are apps that are available. Not only is pornography available, there are apps that are dedicated to nothing else but finding someone to have sex with. Tinder, there's another few out there, Bumble or something. I've got them on the list for next week. I have them remember, okay? But the whole point is I'm looking for commitmentless sex. And they are serving this end, and now they are surveying the young women and the young men that are using these. And you have young women saying, what I've essentially had to do is separate my head from my body. And you have young men that are saying, it's hard to even know how to have a relationship with people. You know what somebody actually suggested that the church needs to actually provide? And maybe we need to do this. That one of the biggest areas that the newest generation is struggling with is they don't even know how to date. Like, they don't know how to have a conversation with somebody. Now, and I'm not picking on that generation. I'm saying that that's what they've said. They don't know how to have a conversation that is not related to, let's hook up. And so all of the freedom that these things claim to provide, I don't have to have a family. I want to do my thing. I want to sow my wild oats. The thing has led to bondage because people are using what God intended for one context in a context that cannot provide the support that it needs, as if it's an abuse of a gift. And yet the reality is these intentions from God are clear. His plan was not to keep us from pleasure. Now, again, do not hear me say, oh man, he's just saying that sexuality is only for procreation. No, I didn't say that. My Bible has Song of Solomon in it. Okay? Don't put words in my mouth. But I'm also saying that keep in mind that when God ordained it and created it, the first thing that he told him to do after it was what? Be fruitful and multiply. What about fertility? Yes. The world we live in is broken. You're not broken. The world we live in is broken. Sin has devastated family. It's devastated our bodies. Cancer wasn't part of the plan. Fertility issues weren't part of the plan. It's not reflective of you go, did I do something wrong to God? No, you didn't do anything wrong to God. He's not punishing you as a result, even though that's what a Hebraic mindset would say. They'd look at somebody like Hannah and go, huh, you don't have a kid, something must be wrong with you. It wasn't because the curse of God was upon her. He had a plan for her. But that doesn't mean that we can't speak to the patterns that he has established. And where there's variance, we recognize that variance doesn't mean that there's something wrong with a person, but that we recognize that we don't take that variance and go, oh, that's what I ought to willfully choose so that I can enjoy certain types of freedom and just choose to abort or use certain types of ways so that I can live for self. Those of you that have raised children know that one of the best things about raising a child is you being taught how selfish you are. It's like, wow, I'm a selfish human being. You thought you were selfish, and you got married, and you're like, oh, wow, I was pretty selfish. And then you start having kids. They're cute until, night 4 being home from the hospital, and they're not going to bed. You're like, I just want them to sleep. When God uses the order that he's created to sanctify us. This is not mistakes. He knew what he was doing to that end. There's so much more to be said here, but I want to move forward just briefly, and I do want to talk in more depth. I do think that I need to say, and that what my wife would want me to say too, is just that I talked to my wife. She's a nurse, and I say, hey, look, I'm thinking about talking about contraception, and that is a conversation that has all kinds of things going on, okay? So do not walk away going, Pastor just said this. I did not. What I said is that we have to have wisdom when we think about those things. There are certain aspects of contraception that I do believe are outside of God's will. I do. There are mechanisms that are based solely upon or secondarily upon abortifacients. And I don't think that conforms to a high view of God's view of life, and that we ought to not agree with those types of things. That doesn't mean that there are not other forms that are acceptable and that we need to work through that. It does not mean, again, as I said, that sexuality is not, that it's only procreative and it's not about pleasure. Listen, if it wasn't about pleasure, he wouldn't have made it pleasurable, okay? Like, he knew what he was doing. But what I want to do is, without making you really mad at me, I want to disrupt us enough to ask questions about things that we have assumed because our culture has said it's right, and go, what does God's word say? What does God's word actually say about these things? As opposed to saying, well, how could that possibly be wrong? How could I possibly need to rethink that?